All right, let's jump right in. We're looking at a fascinating piece of medical detective work today. A story where a single clue, found in our blood, led scientists to a conclusion that nobody saw coming. And it's changing how we think about some of the biggest diseases of our time.
So just imagine for a second, what if there was a single, simple blood test that could flag your future risk for stroke, heart attacks, and Alzheimer's disease? I mean, it sounds like something straight out of sci-fi, but it's a question scientists have been chasing for a while now. The thing is, the answer they found, it's really not what anyone expected.
Now, to really get this story, we first have to understand the common enemy, the one thing that connects all these different conditions. It's a process happening quietly inside all of us called inflammation.
Now, we're not talking about the kind of inflammation you get from a paper cut or a sprained ankle. This is totally different. This is a low-grade, chronic, kind of smoldering irritation that's just humming along in the background, especially inside our blood vessels. You can think of it like your body's defense system being stuck on low alert all the time. And that constant simmering, it's a prime suspect in a lot of age-related diseases.
And what's really interesting is just how far this thing's influence seems to reach. We know this low-grade inflammation is tied up with atherosclerosis. That's the gunk that builds up in your arteries, causing strokes and heart attacks. But here's the kicker. It's also been found at the scene of the crime, so to speak, in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. So you can see the logic, right? If the same kind of inflammation is involved in all three, maybe a single clue could crack the entire case.
So, that brings us to the main event, the investigation itself. With this common suspect, inflammation, in their sights, scientists needed to find one specific piece of evidence to track, a single biological clue.
And that clue, that piece of evidence, is a little protein called interleukin-6, or for short, IL-6. This is the marker our scientific detectives decided to follow.
The easiest way to think about IL-6 is like a signal flare. When your body's inflammation response gets activated, it starts shooting these IL-6 proteins up into your bloodstream. So if we measure the levels, it's like we're counting how many of these inflammatory flares are going off. The more IL-6 you have, the more inflammation is happening somewhere in your body.
So with that in mind, a research team in Japan set out on a very specific mission. They asked a simple question. Could we measure the levels of this one signal flare, IL-6, and use it to reliably predict a person's future risk for stroke, for major heart events, and for Alzheimer's, all in the same group of people?
And their plan was actually pretty straightforward. They got a group of almost 500 patients who already had some risk factors for blood vessel disease. They took a blood sample and measured their starting IL-6 levels. And then came the waiting game. They just followed these people for almost 5 years, carefully tracking who, unfortunately, ended up having a stroke, a serious heart event, or an Alzheimer's diagnosis. It's a really powerful way to do it. Measure the clue now and see what happens down the road.
Okay, so let's get to the results. Because this, right here, is where the whole story takes a really sharp and unexpected turn. After all those years of tracking, the data came in, and it was time to see what it said.
So, did high levels of our signal flare, IL-6, actually predict all three conditions like everyone thought it might? Well, let's look at the verdict for each one separately.
First up, stroke. And the verdict here was absolutely crystal clear. The patients who started the study with the highest levels of IL-6, they had a nearly 5 times higher risk of having a stroke. I mean, that's not a small difference. That is a massive, undeniable connection.
And for what they call major adverse cardiovascular events, things like heart attacks, it was pretty much the same story. That high IL-6 group, they had a 3.7 times greater risk. So far, our signal flare is pointing straight at diseases of the blood vessels.
But then came the twist. When they looked at the risk for Alzheimer's disease, the data showed, well, nothing. Zilch. There was no connection at all. Having a high IL-6 level at the start of the study had absolutely no bearing on who would later develop Alzheimer's dementia. The star witness in the case just suddenly went silent.
And looking at this chart for stroke, it just makes the point so visually. Look at that. As the IL-6 levels go from low to the middle group to high, the risk of stroke just climbs right up with it. It's a perfect stepladder. The more of the marker you have, the higher your risk. It's textbook.
Okay, now contrast that with the chart for Alzheimer's. See? It's completely flat.
The risk for the low, middle, and high IL-6 groups is pretty much identical. There's just no pattern there. Seeing these two charts right next to each other really drives home just how surprising this finding was. IL-6 was a powerful clue for one set of problems, but a total dead end for the other.
So the big question is, so what? What does this actually mean? Why is a result like this so important? Well, it really forces us to get a lot more specific about what we mean when we talk about inflammation and disease.
You know, the study authors themselves said it perfectly in their conclusion. They basically said that this body-wide systemic inflammation seems to be a much bigger deal in causing atherothrombotic events, that's the vessel clogging that leads to strokes and heart attacks, than it is in causing Alzheimer's dementia.
And this really gets to the core of it. We're talking about two fundamentally different processes here. Atherothrombosis is a disease of your body's plumbing, the blood vessels. Neurodegeneration, on the other hand, is a disease of the brain cells themselves. What this study strongly suggests is that our systemic inflammation flare, IL-6, is a great warning signal for trouble in the plumbing, but not necessarily for the trouble happening inside the brain tissue itself. It tells us that not all inflammation is the same.
So let's just boil this all down. What are the big takeaways? First, IL-6 is absolutely a powerful risk marker for vascular diseases like stroke. Check. Second, the whole story of inflammation in Alzheimer's is obviously a lot more complicated than we thought. It might not be this big, body-wide inflammation that's the problem, but maybe a more specific, localized kind of inflammation happening only inside the brain. And finally, this is just a beautiful example of how science really works. It's all about asking better questions and appreciating the nuance, because the simple answers are almost never the whole story.
And all of this leaves us with a brand new and much more focused mystery. If this major signal flare for body-wide inflammation isn't the key to predicting Alzheimer's, it forces us to ask a much deeper question. What other clues, maybe hiding deep inside the brain itself, are we still missing?